Let's talk about all the parameters on the Relab 176 compressor limiter. Think of this as a quick start guide to get you up and running. We'll cover the more advanced stuff like calibration and the back panel controls in a different video. We'll jump right in with input and output. This is a fixed threshold compressor, and that means the input directly affects how hard the signal hits the threshold and ultimately how much gain reduction you're going to get. The input level determines how aggressively the compressor is going to react. So you increase the input gain if you want more compression, reduce it if you want less. You don't set the threshold, you drive into it, much like a Distressor or an 1176. And for me, I find this gives me a natural relationship between saturation and compression. Hotter signals are going to hit this harder, both dynamically and harmonically. It also means that preset behavior is really level dependent. And that's why we put the gain reduction, the intended gain reduction in the preset name. So you can eyeball the gain reduction meter and get a sense of what the preset designer was thinking when they designed the preset. Next is the output level. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. You can use the output level to match the level after compression for clean ABs. And you also have an auto gain, which takes about a second or two to read the average audio going through it, to also automatically match the gain so you can have clean ABs. And the mix knob, of course, which is one of the benefits of software plugins, where you can either run it 100% wet for full compression. Zero obviously is dry, so anywhere in between, you're in parallel compression territory, so you could just dial that into taste. Up at the top here, we have the format switches where you can run the plugin in mono, stereo, or mid-side. And in stereo mid-side, you also have the control link switch, which allows you to either link the controls for mid-side or left and right, or unlink them so you can adjust them independently. And on the mono mode, we have a meter mode selector where you can switch between the VUs and a more modern histogram. On the VUs, you can also select between viewing the input, the output, or the gain reduction. And on the stereo mode, you can see the VUs and the histogram at the same time, so no need for the switch. Okay, so that covers some of the general housekeeping. Like I said, I'll cover calibration and the back panel stuff, and even the oversampling settings in the advanced video. Now let's get into some of the cool stuff. Ratio. We have 2 to 1, 4 to 1, 8 to 1, 12 to 1, and the ratio adjusts the compression strength and knee shape on the 176. That's one of the key things to remember is that the ratio affects the knee shape. If you look at this image, you can see that 2 to 1 has this kind of nice smooth curve to it. 12 to 1, you got a little point in there. So users expect this to be a little more consistent, but this is what gives this unit a lot of its musicality and nonlinearity. And because of this, one of the key things to remember is when you're setting your compression, you might want to start by hitting it around 3 or 4 dB. That's kind of the sweet spot where you can go through the ratios and hear the difference between each of those ratio settings. If you're kind of kissing it with 1 or 2 dB, by the time you get to 12 to 1, you'll actually see you may not actually have any gain reduction because of the changing of that knee. So 3 to 4 is that sweet spot where you can kind of go in and switch those ratios to hear the difference, and then you can adjust your gain reduction to taste once you've decided on the ratio. Then we have the attack control, and that determines how quickly the compressor responds to signals exceeding the threshold and shapes the transient handling, right? So fast for sharp transient control, slow it down for smoother dynamics. But one thing to remember on this, the timing behavior dynamically changes based on the program material and even the interstage mode. And we'll cover the interstage a little later. But the attack in the 176 is not fixed timing, right? That's going to vary based on what you're sending through. So that's why it says fast and slow and not exact numbers. Next, we have release, which controls how quickly the gain reduction recovers after the signal falls below the threshold. And this influences the smoothness or punchiness of the compression recovery. Like attack, this also interacts dynamically with the program material and the fixed auto toggle, which we'll cover next. But generally speaking, fast releases give you a more aggressive compression. Slower releases are going to give you a much smoother sound. Next, we have the fixed and auto toggle switch, and that's changing between static and adaptive program dependent behavior, right? What that means is it's changing the compressor's behavior between consistent timing and dynamically adjusting timing. So you can think of fixed mode as something that provides more consistent, predictable results, and auto mode smooths out dynamic material. Auto mode also reduces intermodulation distortion that might be introduced by the gain reduction, so it tends to run a little cleaner. So auto is great for sources that have changing loudness, and fixed is great for stuff that's a bit more consistent average volume. Next is the interstage in and out switch, and this switches between transformer coupled and resistor coupled stage connections, right? So in transformer coupled, out resistor coupled. Now this changes the transient speed, harmonic saturation, and actually the low frequency tightness of this unit. And a lot of users underestimate just how much of a sonic impact this control has. Right, so with that transformer in, you're going to get subtle frequency coloration, almost like a little bit of a smiley curve. The attack time becomes extremely fast, even faster than the fast setting implies. Like we're down to sub-millisecond response when you're on fast. And the compression tends to feel snappier, tighter, more immediate. And there's a little bit of transient overshoot, but that settles quickly and also adds mild saturation and transformer-related dynamics. And this setting is often a good choice for vocals, snares, plucked instruments, pokey acoustic, and any material that benefits from fast transient control and musically reactive compression. Now, when you bypass the transformer, you route the signal through a clean resistor network, which gives you a much more linear frequency response. But the attack becomes significantly slower, even when set to fast, and it introduces a more pronounced low frequency wobble or thump, which especially on bass heavy sources or sustained tones, you're going to hear that, and also on the lower ratio setting. So like interstage out with 2-to-1 ratio setting, you're really going to get that kind of extra little wobble or bounce in the compression. This is why interstage out is often useful for smoother bus compression or source material where softer transients and tonal rounding are what you're looking for. That's giving an idea of timing differences. Interstage in, your fast setting for your attack is going to be around zero point 0.5 milliseconds. You take the interstage out, and now you're around 35 milliseconds. Kind of noon, midway point, your attack is at 1.4 milliseconds when interstage is in. Interstage out, 45 milliseconds. And then you set that to slow. Interstage in, you're still at 2.7 milliseconds. Interstage out, 50 milliseconds. Now, release kind of stays close to being the same. Fast is about 40 milliseconds for both in and out. 450 milliseconds is your midway point release for in and out, and slow is 800 milliseconds in and out. They're a lot less affected by the interstage in and out. And next is asymmetry, and this is a confusing one for some people. This determines the detector's response polarity, right? So whether it's looking at positive peaks when it's set to positive, negative peaks only when it's set to negative, or you stick it in the middle, and that's looking at both positive and negative equally. And this is something that only affects the sidechain detection, right? It's not affecting the audio directly. It's interacting with the waveform symmetry. But used creatively, it can enhance transient control and harmonic openness just by selecting the waveform polarity. But this is so heavily dependent on the polarity of your signal, right? So if you have something like a kick and you've nailed the polarity and that has a very positive transient, you can set that to positive if you want it to react to that positive transient, or you could try setting it to negative if you wanted to really avoid that transient and maybe smooth out on the negative side of the wave, or you set it in the middle and have it look at both equally and adjust to taste. But this one, like I said, really depends on the polarity of your incoming signal, and then you can just experiment with this to see what sounds good. And here we have the high pass filter frequency, and this runs from 40 hertz to 400. And right underneath, you have the high pass filter on and off switch, so you can just quickly bypass the high pass filter. Now you can set this to reduce pumping or overreaction from kick or low frequency information into the compressor. But it also, when you have the interstage off and you have that wobble, you can also dial that back and it'll help stabilize that as well. So it's really convenient to have. Also in stereo and mid-side, you have the sidechain link control, and that controls just how closely the detector circuit tracks between the left and right and the mid-side channels. So like if you're working in stereo, you can start to reduce that to really give you maybe a bit more of a wider stereo image. And as always, you can just experiment with it and dial it into taste. Hopefully this quick start gets you up and running fast and gives you some insight as to what the 176 can do. Again, we'll do deeper dives on the features and I'll cover the back panel stuff and calibration in a different video. But the key thing is just drop this on your tracks, experiment with the controls, get a sense of what everything can do, the color that this can bring to your tracks, have some fun, and I'll see you in the next one.